Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Mehmet Bey, for this extensive introduction. At the outset, I must commend the Peace Islands Institute and its director, Mehmet Kilic, for continuing to sponsor discussions and dialogues on issues of global concern, like the one we are going to be talking about today. Today's panel discussion on climate change and disaster management on the first anniversary of Hurricane Sandy provides an opportunity to review the link between climate change and how it impacts and exacerbates typhoons and hurricanes like Sandy, which hit our region about a year ago, rather exactly a year ago in 2 days' time. I would like to talk a little bit about climate change and then move on to the adaptation measures that can be taken to reduce the impact of such storms. Climate change is described by the UN Secretary General as the defining issue of our time. And he has emphasized that its effects are being felt all around the world. Last year in June 2012, the Rio Plus 20 conference, or the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, that was held in Rio de Janeiro in June last year, described climate change as one of the greatest challenges of our time and expressed profound concern and alarm that emissions from greenhouse gases were continuing to rise. The heads of state and government, there were at least presidents and prime ministers from about 120 countries there, they recognized that all countries are vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change and were already experiencing increased impacts, including drought and extreme weather conditions, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and ocean acidification, among other factors. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC as it's known, and IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have advocated for quite some time that we should take measures to protect the climate system for the benefit of the present and the future generations. They have highlighted with grave concern the significant gap between the mitigation steps that have been taken, are pledged to be taken to reduce emissions on the one hand, and efforts on the other to hold the increase in global temperatures to below 2 degrees centigrade, or if possible, 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. We are way above that. The IPCC has last month released a summary of its next assessment report based on several years of work and contributions by over 800 scientists from around the world. The conclusion of the report is that it is now more certain, with more than 95% certainty, that human influence or human activity has been the dominant cause for global warming, particularly since the mid-20th century. The last 30 years have probably been the warmest in the last 1,400 years. On the ground, on the air, in the oceans, global warming is undeniable. The IPCC report warns that continued emissions of global greenhouse gas emissions at the current levels will cause further warming and changes in all aspects of the climate system. Now, what are the consequences of climate change? There are a number of them, and I'll like to quote 5 of them. The first one, more heat waves, which will increase the number of deaths, particularly among the elderly, the very young, or among people who are chronically ill or otherwise vulnerable. 2, increased drought in some regions, which will lead to land degradation, damage to crops, or reduced yields, and an increased risk of wildfires. 3, increases in the number and intensity of very strong cyclones, typhoons and hurricanes, and Sandy fits into that description, and a couple of other events that have taken place in the last few weeks, actually. And these will affect coastal regions with potentially large additional losses of lives and assets. 4, sea level rise, as was mentioned a little while ago, coupled with coastal storms, which will increase the impacts of storm surge and river flooding and damage livelihood systems and protective ecosystems. Low-lying settlements may become unviable, which may result in increased potential for movement of population and loss of infrastructure. 5th, but not lastly, higher temperatures and melting glaciers may cause glacial-like outbursts that could flood downstream settlements. How do we address climate change? I'll mention 2 of the tools that have been given to us. One is mitigation. Mitigation refers to the process of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. It is defined as an anthropogenic intervention. Anthropogenic means the one that is caused by human activity. An anthropogenic intervention to reduce the anthropogenic forcing of the climate system. It includes strategies to reduce greenhouse gas and emissions and enhancing greenhouse gas sinks. I don't know if most of us would be conversant with the modality of greenhouse gas sinks. I'll give you an example. Forests, for example, are considered as a sink for absorbing greenhouse gas emissions. And we may not recognize, but 70% of the emissions are attributed to deforestation. And that is why a number of countries and the United Nations system, Norway has been in the lead to work with a number of developing countries on a project called RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and from land degradation. So that is a sink. Deforestation, therefore, contributes to global warming by reducing the capacity of our natural resource base to absorb emissions. And the second tool that is given to us is called adaptation. Taking steps to cope with the changed climate conditions is called adaptation. Adaptation is defined by IPCC as adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Adaptation to climate change is considered as an immediate and urgent global priority. Adaptation measures are taken through disaster risk reduction, which we would be talking about in a little while, which can be described as action taken to reduce the risk of disasters and the adverse effects of natural hazards through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causes of disasters, including through avoidance of hazards, reduced social and economic vulnerability to hazards, and improved preparedness for adverse events. Now, a framework for action would have the following priorities, although there would be others. Number 1, ensure that disaster risk reduction is a national and local priority with a strong institutional basis for implementation. This is a very first imperative when we start to prepare for disaster risk reduction and for management. Number 2, identify, assess, and monitor disaster risks and enhance early warning. I would give later on an example of a recent storm where early warning and preparedness saved thousands of lives. Use knowledge, innovation, and education to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels. Reduce the underlying risk factors, including environmental and societal factors that create or exacerbate the risks from natural hazards. And lastly, strengthen disaster preparedness for effective response at all levels. The issue of vulnerability to natural hazards and disaster risks must remain central to the discussions on climate change, and progress must be made to effectively and fairly address the increased risks. I would like to give two examples of recent events. Probably I may not have time for both, but I would like to refer to the case of Australian fires, which we may have heard of a few weeks ago. The worst fires to hit the New South Wales state of Australia in more than a decade has raised questions about what, if any, lessons have been learned from previous bushfires tragedies and raised a controversy over the federal government's position on climate change. And I'll talk about the controversy a little later. The early start to the bushfire season in New South Wales province has prompted warnings that the province could face the same conditions that led to the 2009 fires in the state of Victoria, the worst in Australian history. Those fires claimed 173 lives and caused more than $4 billion in damage. A report by Australia's leading climate change advisory board has warned that climate change is increasing the probability of extreme bushfire conditions. It states that climate change is making days hotter and heat waves more frequent and severe. It further states that intense and frequent hot weather, as well as dry conditions, increases the likelihood of extreme fire weather days. Now, there has been a controversy. The Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, or the new Prime Minister of Australia, has argued with the Climate Council of Australia and with other scientists as to whether climate change is a cause of these recent bushfires in the state of New South Wales. Although he does recognize the necessity to deal with the climate change issue, but there is disagreement between his climate change advisory board, our council, and himself as to whether climate change has contributed to the bushfires in New South Wales. And now the second case I want to mention also, which happened a couple of weeks ago, the cyclone Phelan in India, on the eastern coast of India. Cyclone Phelan hit the eastern coast of India, particularly the states of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh, earlier this month. The last time a storm as powerful as Cyclone Phelan struck the same area in 1999, 10,000 people died, and 1 million people were left homeless. Phelan arrived earlier this month with winds of about 140 miles per hour. Thanks to the lessons learned in 1999, and this is very important, our friend from FEMA would talk about that. And the authorities actually were very prepared. They had a system in place whereby, first of all, they could get early warnings, and secondly, to start preparing for the eventuality. So the loss of life was limited to 15 people as against 10,000 14 years earlier. Considering that Phelan was the strongest tropical storm to hit the area in more than a decade and a half, the toll could have been much higher, with meteorologists warning that climate change will bring more severe natural calamities to the Indian subcontinent. States like Odisha and Andhra Pradesh have invested heavily in disaster risk reduction projects. Both states have their own disaster management plans and have built hundreds of cyclone shelters across the eastern coast. Just as the alarm bells rang for Phelan, 900,000 people were evacuated to shelters in schools and government offices. Authorities also moved food and medicine close to the affected areas before the storm could hit.